All right, class, welcome. And today we're going to have a very, very fun conversation, a very informative conversation. We've already been talking for about 20 minutes, and I feel like I've learned a lot. But there's so many more questions to have. We have with us today Dr. Josh Roberson from the University of Memphis. And I'll let him get into his background and his professional background in a little bit. But what we are going to talk about is everybody knows Disney Plus is showing the most recent MCU series, Moon Knight, and that uses Egyptian mythology very heavily in that series. And so I wanted to talk to Josh about the accuracy of that portrayal. And so that's what this conversation is going to be about. And I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you really enjoy it. To get started, Dr. Robertson, could you welcome to the class, and could you give us a little bit of information about your background as first a fan of Disney and Marvel, and kind of what has brought your interest to talking to us today about this?
Sure. Yeah, so first, thanks for having me. This is an interesting topic. I'm glad to be part of it. In terms of Disney and Marvel, I think as most people who probably grew up in this country, I was heavily exposed to the sort of golden age movies of the Disney era that I kind of grew up with, and kind of gave me my first sort of taste of cinematic animation, which was a big influence on me, because I remain interested in animation to this day. Wider sort of world of animation, Japanese animation, things of this nature. But certainly Disney and its sort of golden age films kind of put me on that path. In terms of the Marvel universe, I was a huge comics fan, particularly Marvel Comics fan. Growing up, I was very, very familiar with basically the entire Marvel comics world up through about the 90s. When I stopped reading them on a regular basis, my favorites were Doctor Strange and the X-Men and even Moon Knight. And more recently, though, I've like, I think again probably most people in this country have consumed all or most of the MCU material. I think they've done a great job adapting those comics to the big screen for the most part, and so I definitely consider myself a fan, and that's why I'm happy to talk about this from the perspective of an Egyptologist.
And thank you for that. And real quickly, have you seen the teaser trailer they put out for Thor: Love and Thunder? Did you see that?
I haven't seen the latest teaser trailer. I've only seen I saw the initial sort of poster they put out with Natalie Portman a few years ago, and I saw a video from a Comic-Con or something, but I haven't seen this.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I have not.
Oh, there's a scene in the teaser trailer that comes, I mean, almost straight from the pages of the comics. It almost looks like, obviously didn't, but it almost looks like they traced it from the comics into one of those scenes. So it's pretty interesting. And I mentioned that because you mentioned, page to screen and their adaptations and everything. So when I was getting my notes together, I kind of made a few changes here and there to kind of start talking about this subject. But I think the best place to start is, as an Egyptologist, the first question is, what do you think the importance is that Egyptian mythology is being portrayed in the MCU, and that it's portrayed in mass entertainment and mass media as a whole? What's the importance of that as far as exposing people to these lessons and to these stories?
Yeah, it's Egypt since the 1920s. Egypt has been probably the sexiest of the ancient subjects to sort of grace popular culture ever since the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. And so we've seen a pretty steady stream, I mean, almost, I would say, nonstop stream of movies and books and TV shows and comic books and all kinds of things that incorporate Egyptian elements to a greater or lesser extent. And so Egypt is very much ingrained in Western popular culture as a result of this. And it's one of these sort of blessing and curse combination things for professionals like myself who study Egypt from a scholarly perspective. It's primarily a blessing. And I think that most Egyptologists are very pleased to see how popular Egypt is, because that popularity gets people interested in talking about the ancient world, and specifically the culture that we as Egyptologists study. And so that puts warm bodies in seats for classes. It gets people to come to museums. It gets people to go to lectures. It gets people to buy books about the subject and learn more about it. Maybe that becomes, maybe it sparks a lifelong passion in them. Many of my colleagues that are my generation and even younger or even older actually got into the field because of popular culture in some form or another. I mean, I know that my first interest in studying the ancient world came from Indiana Jones. Okay. Full stop. And if you ask, I would say a huge number of people from, I mean, if not a majority, then a huge slice of Egyptologists of my generation, plus or minus one, that they will tell you the same thing, that Indiana Jones got them into this. And so because it was filled with Egyptian stuff and it was archaeology of a sort and things, and so when you see something like Moon Knight or something like the Prince of Egypt, things like this that have they're taking sort of the ancient Egyptian culture and putting it into a form that's easily digestible by a modern audience, I think that's almost exclusively a good thing, because it's spreading knowledge that it exists, and then even if it's not completely accurate at all times, that number one, that's fine, because they're works of fiction, and you shouldn't take your knowledge of ancient stuff from works of fiction, And so I think most people can differentiate those things, and so that's okay if it's not completely accurate, because it's a work of fiction. But number two is that it makes people aware that it exists in the first place, and it's advertisement, in other words. And the basic rule of that all advertisers know, and that most consumers don't seem to appreciate, is that the only reason you consume anything is because of advertising. You simply wouldn't know it existed if it hadn't been advertised to you. And so the appearance of Egypt in popular culture is hugely important for that reason. The only real downside to it is you get a lot of misinformation out there that leads to folks thinking things that are often easily disproven or are simply not true or whatever. But that's okay, because then it prompts a discussion, and it, ideas are exchanged, and so really I don't see any downside. I think it's all good.
Well, and it all it helps on, as we were talking about before. It gets someone whose training is in the entertainment and sport business to try to talk about these subjects as well, and try to learn more about these subjects. And so there's also we'll first talk about your professional background and expertise. Okay. So could you give us a little bit about what your professional training is, what your expertise area is, and what you write about?
Yeah. So I went to undergraduate. As an undergraduate, I went to the University of North Texas. I'm from Texas, from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and I majored in anthropology, and I minored in philosophy. And I had other interests in college than being super scholarly. I had a lot of fun in college, and so I was kind of only marginally taking it seriously. I was not a very serious student at that time as an undergrad. But I made a promise to myself that if I could persuade a graduate school that did what I wanted to do to take me in, that I would completely reinvent myself from day one and become, the best student and then professional that I could be. And I did that. So I ultimately went to the University of Pennsylvania, which is an Ivy League institution in Philadelphia. It's one of only a handful of universities in this country that offers a Ph.D. in what I do, which is ancient Egyptian language. And so I got my professional training there. I am a specialist in the language of ancient Egypt in all of its phases. And my particular interest in the language is how religious texts are used in ancient Egypt, and what religious texts say, and what they do that seems strange or hard to understand from our perspective, but then when you actually read them from the Egyptians' perspective, you can sort of figure out that they actually make very good sense and are very logical from the ancient people's perspective. That's sort of what I'm interested in. And so since I graduated, I got my PhD in 2007. And I've worked here and there right after I graduated, but I've worked here at the University of Memphis as a tenure track and now tenured professor for since 2015. So for I guess about 7 years I've been here at University of Memphis. And in the years since I graduated and up until now, I've written about 50 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and things of that nature, and 4 books, single-authored books, all of which concern in one way or another Egyptian religion and Egyptian language. So my primary research interest lies with the images and texts that appear in the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These are compositions that basically depict and describe the world of the gods and the dead that the Egyptians hoped to encounter when they died. And so that's sort of my professional bio in a very brief nutshell.
Okay. All right. And it brings up a lot of questions, and also your earlier comment about getting into this interest because of Indiana Jones. I share that interest. I think, as you said, so many different people share that interest, and it has kind of piqued a lot of people's to try to learn more about it, and because it's so fun, and it looked, obviously it's they took creative liberties with everything, but it just looked like such a fun thing to study and try to learn more about. I want to, for people listening or watching in the class, and those people who are not in the class that are listening or watching, I want to spend a few minutes before we get into Moon Night talking about our city's ties to Egypt, and our university's ties to the study of Egyptology. And I jotted down a few things. The name of the name of the ancient Egyptian capital being Memphis. The fact that in this city we have a pyramid in downtown, which, interestingly, for everybody who doesn't know, used to be a basketball arena and now is a Bass Pro Shop. We have a really, really great department on campus. We have a really, really great museum on campus. We have a statue, and forgive me if I mispronounce his name, but Ramesses II. That statue was moved from the pyramid in downtown to our campus, and so those are a few of the things that I have known just from kind of the, I guess, the popular culture aspect of it. But this city does have a lot of ties to Egyptian mythology and ancient Egypt. Could you tell us some more about that?
Yeah, the Memphis was actually founded specifically with the intention of being the new Memphis, the Memphis on the American Nile. So the ancient city of Memphis was located at the tip of the Nile River Delta, where the river sort of branches off into this triangle shape that then empties into the Mediterranean Sea. And the ancient city of Memphis, which was Egypt's first capital, it wasn't its only capital, it was its first capital, is sort of right there at the tip of that delta. And so when the site for the modern city of Memphis was selected, I think it was Andrew Jackson actually who selected it, it was chosen specifically at the point of the Mississippi River Delta as a link back to the ancient city of Memphis, because they wanted it to be the new Memphis that would be a hub for government and trade in the region, much like the ancient city of Memphis was. So that was actually part of the city's foundation right from the very beginning. And so it does have that connection. Just incidentally, the name Memphis, by the way, is that's a Greek pronunciation of how the Greeks heard the ancient Egyptian name of Menefer. It means something like enduring in beauty or something like this. And so because of that connection to Egypt, all the way back in the 1960s, I think, I don't think it goes back to the 50s, but at least to the 60s, there was a businessman whose name escapes me who had this idea of building a pyramid here. Because the ancient city of Memphis is very near to most of the major pyramid fields from ancient Egypt, and most famously Giza. But that Giza is only one of many pyramid fields in Egypt, and most of those are within eyesight, basically, of the ancient city of Memphis. And so back in the 60s, there was this idea to build a pyramid in the American Memphis, and the interest and funding for it didn't actually materialize until I think like the early 80s or something, when the building was finally constructed. And as you mentioned, it was I think originally they wanted it to be a convention center or something, and then it was purchased for basketball team, and then of course it was purchased by the Bass Pro Shop, and now it has a gigantic monumental Bass Pro Shop and Ducks Unlimited logo on it, which is really bizarre and just makes it the most strange of all pyramids in the world. It is actually I think like it's something like the 6th largest pyramid outside of Egypt or something.
Okay.
It's a really incredible building, to be honest. It's amazingly impressive to see in person, and to go up onto the observation deck and to see it from inside. And I think it's one of the neatest elements of this city. The statue that you mentioned of Ramses II, the original of that statue is no longer here. It was returned to Egypt, and the one that we see now that was moved, as you mentioned, is a replica of it. It's an exact replica, more or less, and it stands now on the campus right near the Art and Communication building.
Real quick,
in Egypt. Go ahead.
Real quick, is there what is the significance of Ramses II to? Why did the city of Memphis get a statue of Ramses II?
In the short answer is because the university and the Institute of Egyptian Art and Archaeology hosted a Ramses exhibit in the late 80s, early 90s.
Okay.
And it was part of this just citywide celebration of Egypt in general and of Ramses II specifically. Ramses II is one of the most widely known kings from ancient Egypt because he just built so much in his lifetime. He reigned for like 60 some odd years, and which is a very, very long time in the ancient world. And so in that time, he built basically in every major and most minor sites throughout the ancient country of Egypt. And so he's left a very large footprint on the surviving material from the ancient culture. And so they had this exhibit to sort of celebrate, his life and times, and then to sort of tie it back to, as a celebration of Memphis as like having this connection to Egypt. But Ramses himself is really, he's a very famous pharaoh. We here at the university have, for instance, a major field project that takes place at the Temple of Karnak. That's the largest temple ever constructed anywhere. And it's in the area that was constructed primarily by and for Ramses and his father also, Seti.
Okay. That's incredibly interesting. And when you mentioned the foundation of the American city of Memphis, I do remember hearing a little bit about that. But that was a while ago. So
it was way before my time.
That. Yeah. Well, I mean, it was a while ago that I heard it. I forgot about that. That's thank you for mentioning that. And so then one more thing before we get into the accuracy of the MCU's portrayal in Moon Knight is, before we were recording, I asked, just so people understand, and so I understand better, what is the difference between the study of Egyptology and the study of Egyptian mythology?
Sure. Well, Egyptology means simply the study of ancient Egypt. And so that includes a huge variety of areas of expertise and specialization. And any Egyptologist who is an actual working Egyptologist is expected to be reasonably conversant with all of that stuff, even though they have a specialty then in this or that, 2 or 3 things. And so the study of Egyptology encompasses the study of the Egyptian language, the study of Egyptian archaeology and all of its aspects, all of their material culture, from pottery to architecture to tools, and the study of Egyptian art and art history, which is also part of material culture, but it's sort of its own specialized subset. And then the study of Egyptian ideas, their religion, their views on gender and self and other, their views on ethics, and so basically everything that the ancient Egyptian culture did, anything the ancient Egyptian culture did, is the purview of an Egyptologist. That's what they study, with the caveat that, of course, everybody specializes in certain things more than others. Mythology is one component of that. Mythology is simply the stories that any religion or even any culture tells about their perceived world that they live in and how it relates to the gods and the dead and the spiritual world and things like this. It's the stories that they tell about how the world came to be the way that it is and why things are the way that they are. And so mythology answers questions that direct observation couldn't answer for the people, or that now in modern times mythology answers questions that, for instance, science is not really designed to explore. Science asks certain questions that are intended to come up with specific answers, and those aren't generally the same answers that mythology is looking for. So all religions have a mythology. Any religion that's ever existed, their beliefs about how they got to be where they are and what their relationship is to the universe, that is their mythology. And mythology is not anything that's true or false. It's just the stories that a religion tells about their origins, their relationship to the gods, etc.
Okay. And then I'm glad you mentioned mythology being the stories, because then we do get to, excuse me, in popular culture, the term mythos is used a lot.
Right.
And we had talked about mythos. So real quickly, what's the difference between mythology and mythos?
Right. So from my perspective, and you might find somebody else who would use these words a little, who would use the word mythos a little different than me. But from my perspective, and from my own experience as a professional and as a consumer of popular culture, I would say that the term mythos is generally used for the connected world of a fictional universe. And so the earliest use of it that I'm aware of is with regard to the universe, the shared universe that the stories of H.P. Lovecraft take place in. And there was a later author named August Derleth who called this the Cthulhu mythos. And that was a hugely influential body of work on everyone who basically wrote science fiction, horror, or fantasy fiction after that. And so from that use of the term mythos, I think we get things like the Marvel mythos or the DC mythos. But generally speaking, I would say that the term mythos applies to the interconnected world of a fictional universe that's agreed upon widely to be fictional, as opposed to the universe of any given religion, which, of course, from the perspective of the people in that religion, they consider their mythology to be, either an accurate depiction of what the world's really about, or an accurate metaphor for what the world's really about. But they don't think of it as a fictional thing per se, as opposed to, say, the world of the Marvel Cinematic Universe or Marvel Comics, where everyone agrees that this is not a real thing that actually happened, and yet it exists in a universe that has its own internal logic and its own internal sequence of events and things like this. So it's from that would be a mythos. As opposed to, say, the beliefs of the ancient Greeks would not be a mythos. They would have a mythology that discussed, their gods and their interactions with the spiritual world and things.
Okay. And thank you for that distinction. It's a very important distinction, because when we talk about Marvel and we talk about the Marvel mythos, and specifically Marvel draws from mythologies from different. I mean, everybody knows about Thor. They're drawing from different, and Zeus exists in the Marvel mythos, and so they draw from mythology, but they're creating it in their own fictional world. So they obviously take some creative liberties with it, whatever will fit with their story, or and so that's what I want to talk about is the overall accuracy, and then there's some questions that we can get into, but to start, the overall accuracy of the portrayal, what we are seeing on the Disney Plus series Moon Knight about Egyptology and Egyptian mythology.
Right.
How accurate is that to you?
Before I tell you what I think about the accuracy of the Egyptian components of Moon Knight, I want to share with you a very brief story that doesn't concern me, but was told to me by my advisor as a graduate student, because it directly relates to what you just asked, in I think a very humorous way. So my graduate advisor, when I was a student at University of Pennsylvania, was invited to the premiere of the movie The Mummy, the original movie The Mummy with Brendan Fraser, not the original Mummy with Boris Karloff, of course, but the original remake, or whatever you want to call it, with Brendan Fraser, that came out in the early 90s. And anyone who's ever seen that movie knows that it's like sort of an action movie, and it's kind of funny and things like this. And my professor was at this party in Hollywood, and Brendan Fraser came up to him. And he starts the conversation. Fraser starts the conversation with my professor by saying, "Did we get it right?" and my professor says, he's like, let's looked at him, because he's like, I didn't even know where to begin. There's so much to unpack with that statement. It's like, did you get it right? Like, well, how can you even ask me that question? But so now, to back up from that, there's actually a lot more that is accurate about Egyptian mythology in the recent Moon Knight series than there was in the Brendan Fraser movie. In fact, I can say there's probably only two things from that movie that were actually historically accurate. Like two words, literally two words.
Okay.
But in Moon Knight, I actually have been, I guess they've done 3 episodes now, right?
They just dropped the 4th one on Wednesday.
Just Wednesday, yeah. So I couldn't remember if I'd watched 3 or 4, but so first of all of the Egyptian gods that are mentioned in it, and the demon Ahmet, these are all real Egyptian figures. Every single one of them is real. They all have stories about them. They're of greater and lesser importance. And before talking about any individual deities from that group, one of the things that I liked in not this most recent episode, but the previous episode, was that the gods called a council to discuss a problem that they were having with one of their members, which was Khonsu, and which is, by the way, the correct way to pronounce his name. I don't know why the comics and the show chose to mispronounce his name as Khonshu. I have a theory about why they did that, but the god's name, the actual god's name, is Khonsu.
What's your theory? Why did
there's another god named Shu,
okay.
and the god Khonsu, the Greeks pronounced it, or actually the Egyptians in the later period of their history pronounced his name Khons. And I'm wondering if if the authors in the Marvel universe combined Khons and Shu, and combined 2 different gods' names. I don't know. It's just a guess, but because Shu is definitely an Egyptian god, and he's not mentioned amongst the other gods that are in that group in the show or in the comic, to my knowledge. So I'm guessing that they conflated those 2 names either on purpose or accidentally. I don't know.
Did they put any of their characteristics to get, are any of those characteristics combined?
I'll hold that.
Okay.
So the thing that I liked about the episode prior to this current one was that the gods met in council.
Yeah.
To discuss a problem that they were having with Khonshu. And that's a very Egyptian idea, because the gods in ancient Egyptian mythology are very sort of legalistic, legally minded, and they like to meet in these councils to discuss problems that they're having amongst themselves, and so to have them sort of accusing one of their members of doing something that they didn't like and trying to persuade him not to do it. this is a very Egyptian sort of idea. It makes me think of, for instance, there's a story called the myth of the destruction of the sun's eye, or something like this. Modern names are different, where the Egyptian sun god decides that he wants to destroy mankind, and so he sends out his daughter, who's this raging lioness, to destroy mankind. But then he changes his mind while she, in the middle of her slaughtering humankind, he changed his mind, decides, no, I don't want to kill everyone. But she's so enraged with bloodlust that he can't make her come back. And the gods meet to talk about this. And they're like, oh my God, Hathor, this goddess, she's completely going berserk and murdering everyone. And we can't make her come back. What do we do? And they like have one of these convergence, or like meetings, these conclaves, where they discuss this problem of a god who's behaving in a way that's against what they want, and how do we get them to bring them back into the fold. And so to see that in the show, I thought was really cool, because it's a very Egyptian sort of idea. In terms of their attributes, the god, that's an interesting question, because all the gods appear, with the exception of Khonshu, appear in, so far anyway, appear in fully human form. Khonshu himself appears as a human with an avian head of some kind. And so there's the way that Egyptians depicted their gods in their art is widely misunderstood, because many Egyptian gods would appear as in human form, but with an animal's head, like a falcon or a jackal or whatever. And so this leads folks to the reasonable but incorrect conclusion that the Egyptians thought their gods looked like that. And in fact, it's not, because Egyptian art never shows you the way things actually looked to the eye. It's specifically designed to not show you the way things look to the eye. Instead, it's meant to show you the eternal aspect of things, the way that things are ideally. And so it's meant to show you the idea of a thing rather than the thing itself. And so it's for this reason that gods have animal heads in Egyptian art. So for instance, a god that has, like Anubis, has a jackal's head, because he is jackal-like in his actions, meaning that jackals were known to break into tombs and rummage around in dead bodies and things. And so they had an intimate knowledge of the human body. And Anubis is a god who deals with mummification and the preparation of the human corpse. And so he's jackal-like in that regard. Or the god Horus, who is actually mentioned in the show, has a role in the show. The god Horus is depicted frequently as having a hawk's head, because Horus is hawk-like in that he swoops down from above to annihilate his enemies, much as a hawk swoops down to kill its prey. Okay. And so the art that shows these mixed form deities is not really showing you what the gods looked like. The gods were gods, so they could look like whatever they wanted. Yeah. And when we read descriptions of them interacting with each other, the descriptions seem to imply that they look most of the time just like human beings. Okay. And so showing all of the gods in that conclave as basically fully human, that's completely consistent with what Egyptian texts that talk about the gods interacting would describe. In terms of Khonshu's appearance, he's got this bird's head. And that's which the liberty they've taken is they've given him this very cool sort of skeleton bird head, which I think is amazing. It looks great. The reason they've given him that bird's head is because in Egyptian art, Khonsu, the actual god Khonsu, can be shown with a falcon head, and so the head that he has in the show is clearly not a falcon. It looks like an ibis. Which is actually, which I'm wondering how much thought they put into it, because an ibis is actually the animal that's associated with another god named Thoth, who's a god of knowledge and writing. But Thoth, his role overlaps to a certain extent with Khonsu in later periods of Egyptian religion. So that might be why they chose the ibis head. I suspect they chose the ibis head because it makes a cooler looking skeleton head than a falcon head, because it's got the long beak. Yeah. But the fact that he has a bird head is broadly consistent with some representations. In most ancient representations of Khonsu, he appears as a child. Okay. Because, and this is actually relevant to your earlier question about Memphis, because Khonsu's primary role in Egyptian mythology is that he's got two. He's a moon god, which is why he was chosen as the god for moon night. He is a god of the moon, but he's also a child god, and he is specifically the child of the god Amun, who's the king of the gods, and Mut, who is his consort. And that triad, Amun, Mut, Khonsu, was the specific group of gods who were worshipped at the ancient city of Memphis.
Okay. Very interesting. Listening all that,
the city of Memphis, let me rephrase that. Let me back up a minute. like I just caught myself. Ptah was the actual tutelary deity of Memphis, but Amenmut and Khonsu were the triad of the king of the gods, who actually, now I think about it, was associated with Thebes, which is to the south. But nevertheless, that's Khonsu's primary role. He is a child god of the king of the gods,
Okay.
but also a god of the moon.
And you had mentioned Shu.
Yeah.
And art, does the character Khonshu in Marvel mythos, beyond just kind of almost combining their names or putting their names together, does that character actually have characteristics of both Khonsu and Shu?
Shu is a god of the air and of the sun, and so he can be described as a creator god. Most of the gods can be described as creator gods, but Shu is specifically the personification of light and emptiness.
Okay.
And so like in the atmosphere that's not moist. Basically, the Egyptians conceived of the atmosphere as consisting of an empty space that was bright, and that's Shu. And they conceived of the atmosphere of consisting of moisture, and that's Shu's sister, Tefnut. So Shu is a god who's generally depicted in human form. He's a very ancient god. He's mentioned all the way back in the oldest religious texts from ancient Egypt. But he's not so connected to the mythology of Khonsu. And so I'm not sure why he was, if indeed they chose to integrate those two gods' names, if they just thought it sounded better or whatever, but he's not so directly connected to the mythology of the moon or anything like Khonsu is. And that's clearly why Khonsu was chosen for this series and for the comic originally, is because it is moon night, and so they wanted the Egyptian moon god. And so there you go.
Sounds like maybe we should try to call in some of the creators of Moon Knight to ask them that question. So he's also in the show, he's depicted as the god of vengeance. Where does that come from?
Yeah, so there's not really a god of vengeance per se in ancient Egypt. Usually when we think in those terms of a god who avenges or who gets retribution for a crime, the god that normally comes to mind is Horus. Horus is one of the most important gods from ancient Egypt because he was considered to be the living king. And that's actually something else that the Moon Knight series has that's quite Egyptian in its aspect, is that the Egyptian king was believed to be a human being who was inhabited by the god Horus.
Okay.
And so just like in Moon Knight, how these different avatars are human beings who have the god sort of living in their head and directing them around and whatnot, that's precisely how the Egyptians conceived of their king. They knew that their king was a human being who was born from human parents and who would eventually die a human death. But from the day that they took the throne, they essentially became possessed by the god of kingship, who is Horus. And Horus is the avenger of his father. Horus's father was Osiris, who was murdered by his brother Seth. And so it's Horus's job in Egyptian mythology to stop his uncle Seth from claiming the throne in this illegal scheme to, he murdered Osiris. And so Horus comes back after his father's been killed, and he fights Seth over a long series of contests and eventually triumphs to become the king of the gods. And so the king of Egypt is then incarnating Horus. And so Horus is the god that we normally associate with that kind of revenge for wrongs that have been committed. However, in the late period of Egyptian's history, in the Greek and the Roman era, Khonsu does overlap to a certain extent with Horus in this role as a sort of righter of wrongs, and as someone who addresses this who can be sort of pled to for protection and things like this. And so he does take on some of those sort of Horus-like attributes as a protector and righter of wrongs. But primarily we associate that with the god Horus.
Thanks for that. The in episode 1, when we meet Stephen Grant, he's the gift shop worker at the British Museum, and he points out there's a mistake on the promotional posters. And am I pronouncing it correctly when I say because it's pronounced in the show the Iniad?
Right.
Is that correct pronunciation? So he points out that there's a mistake, that they have 7 on the poster and there should be 9. Now in the show, that seems to point to the fact that Khonshu and Ahmet were part of that, and because later on you find out they had been expelled and things like that. But can you tell us a little bit about the Iniad in Egyptian mythology?
Yeah, so Iniad is actually a Greek word that means a group of 9. And it's the Greek translation of an Egyptian word, which is Pasejet, which means a group of 9. Okay. And so essentially the Iniad are the first 9 gods who represent the sort of unfolding of creation from the moment of creation, sort of like the Egyptian Big Bang, up until the emergence of the world in which human beings live. And so essentially what happens is Egyptians sort of looked around the world, they, like every culture, they wanted to know how the world came to exist.
Yeah.
And so since they didn't have any experimental way to test this or anything, all they had to rely on was observation and logic. And so essentially they looked around themselves and saw a world that consisted of a plurality of things. There's ground and sky, there's people and animals and birds and fish, and there's all of these different things. But they recognized that all these different things came, like every living thing, for instance, came from a pair, a biological pair. And so there was like reproduction that went on that led to this multiplication and growth of living things. And so they reasoned that if living things seem to be increasing over time, then if you went back in time, there would be fewer things. And if you went back far enough in time, there'd be one thing, and then maybe even nothing. And so they figured that the creation of everything had to come from originally nothingness. And so, because they figured that before there's something, there must be nothing, which is a fairly reasonable conclusion to make. And so they conceived of the pre-created state as a sort of infinite sea of pure potential, which had no things in it. It didn't have, and so since it didn't have any things, it didn't have any passage of time, for instance. It was just a sort of endless kind of matrix of the possibility for things to exist. And at some point, because there's no time, so you can't say it happened before, during, or after, but at some point, one of those infinite possibilities sort of became aware of itself as a thing. And that's the creator God. And the creator God starts to exist. He in Egyptian terms, he creates himself. He creates himself by the act of recognizing that he's there. So initially, he's just one potential amongst infinite potential, but then he suddenly realizes, hey, I am me. And so when that happens, suddenly there is a thing for the first time. There's a specific thing, which is the creator God. And his simple realization that he exists starts the process of creation. And so he creates the first pair of gods, which are, in fact, air and moisture, Shu and Tefnut. And from those 2 gods come the next pair of gods, the earth and sky. And then from those 2 gods, the earth and the sky, come 4 more gods who are their children that represent different sort of moral and legal aspects. And that group constitutes the Iniad, which is the first 9 gods who sort of personify the creation of the world. And they can be viewed as sort of successive emanations of the original creator God. Now, in that group, it includes, the major gods of Egypt, like Osiris and Isis and Shu and Tefnut, and the creator God himself, who is the sun, called different names. But one individual that's definitely not part of the Iniad is Ahmet. And so Ahmet is not a god. Ahmet, or not a god in the sense of a being that had temples and people who worshipped her. Ahmet personifies absolute destruction of the soul. Her name literally means she who swallows or devours, with reference to the soul of someone who's being judged after death. The Egyptians were the first people in the world to invent the idea of judgment after death. Other cultures that were contemporary with the Egyptians did not seem to have this notion of judgment, that basically when you died, you seem to have just sort of gone to a sort of gray kind of nothing, where good and evil alike were just sort of floating around in sort of a purgatory type situation. But the Egyptians very early on seem to have had this idea that when you died, your spirit was brought before a court or tribunal of the gods and judged for the actions it committed in life. And if your actions that you committed fell in line with the blueprint for the world that the creator God made at the beginning of time, then you would be judged what's called in Egyptian terms true of voice, and that means that you would then enjoy your afterlife. If you were found to have committed actions or too many actions or whatever the case may be that were contrary to the creator God's plan for everything, then you would become one of the damned. And for the Egyptians, becoming one of the damned meant that your soul would be completely and utterly annihilated. That first that it would be cut into many, many bits very painfully, and then those bits would be destroyed. And they could, so that nothing remained, your spirit, your name, nothing, you would cease to exist. And Ahmet personifies that destruction of the unjustified soul. And so she's depicted in Egyptian art as a composite monster who includes elements from all of Egypt's most sort of voracious predators. So she has like the head of a hippopotamus, which is an extraordinarily dangerous and vicious animal to encounter in the wild, very deadly. We like think of them as these sort of floating happy things, but hippopotami are actually some of the most dangerous creatures you could possibly encounter in the wild.
Do not go near one.
Right. And then like she has the forequarters of a leopard, and she has like lion parts and all this other kind of stuff. And so she is this sort of composite creature who embodies all of these scary predators who could kill human beings. And so again, she's not shown that way because she necessarily was thought to look like that, but rather to show the idea of an inescapable total ball of destruction. And if you're judged to be not true of voice, then your soul is promptly thrown into her jaws and you cease to be. And so that's Ahmet's role in ancient Egyptian religion. And then in Moon Knight, she of course has a sort of agency. She talks. We saw her at the end of the last episode actually, and we could see her hippopotamus head actually standing at the door, which I thought was pretty cool. And so she has agency. She has ideas of her own. She has an agenda, and this is different. This diverges from the Egyptian conception because in ancient Egyptian religion, she's a personification, which means she doesn't have agency as a being who thinks and makes plans. Rather, she personifies a basic principle of the universe, in this case, destruction.
Okay. And so, yeah, you said like the way she is portrayed in the series and her avatar is portrayed in the series is kind of like that judgment of if a person is good or not good. And whereas on the other side, you have Khonshu, who is saying he is kind of the true justice because he only does it after people have died. So real quick, what do you make of that? Like, is that just creative liberty that they've taken for the story or what?
So, I mean, yes, but it is consistent with what the Egyptians viewed as correct. Everything that that happens either adheres to the creator God's blueprint or it doesn't adhere to it. That blueprint is also a personification that's called Ma'at. And so if your actions help sustain the world that the creator God set in motion, then you are acting in accordance with Ma'at. You're acting in line with the blueprint that the creator set forth. But the Egyptians very much believed that you had this sort of capacity for free will that would allow you to do things that were decidedly contrary to that blueprint. And so in the and those are actions that would ultimately get you destroyed after death. And so in the series, for Ahmet to sort of jump ship and decide to not pursue her allotted role, which is to devour the souls of people who have committed crimes in life, and then to destroy them after death. For her to sort of jump the line and say, well, I'm going to preemptively judge them for something that they will do in the future is completely contrary to what is considered proper in Egyptian thought. And so Khonshu rather in the show is exactly right that he is upholding the correct means of behavior. Ahmet is not in and of herself an evil being. She simply is performing a necessary function of destroying bad souls, basically. But this is supposed to happen at a particular time. And she is in the show, she is breaking out of that role to sort of seek out her brand of justice before the crime has happened. And that removes the element of free will, which is central to the idea of judgment for the Egyptians, because you have the ability to make choices, either good or bad, that then lead to your judgment. And so for her to sort of preemptively judge you takes away your agency and gives it to her. And so Khonshu, the character, is precisely right from the Egyptian perspective to be seeking her out to stop her. And he's precisely right to be concerned that the other gods don't find this disturbing, or that they don't realize the threat that this poses to their order, because what she is doing is completely contrary to the order that they live by.
So then here's another question, because and when you were answering that, I apologize if it looked like I was looking down at my phone, because I was trying to fast forward to the cast, the credits. So thank you. And because in episode 4, you said you like that we saw this like kind of personification of Ahmet at the end of episode 4.
Right.
That god or being, psychic manifestation, we don't know what it is yet in the series, because we don't know really what's going on in the series through 4 episodes, or how it's going to end, I should say, is they are crediting that as Tawaret. And am I pronouncing that
did they
correct?
credit it as
Yes.
I thought that was going to be Ahmet. That's
because
too bad.
Earlier,
I thought earlier it was going to be her. Okay, well, so then let me rephrase. I thought for sure that was going to be Ahmet, because they have similar heads, they have similar faces. It's sort of hippopotamus type thing, or something, or Ahmet can also have a crocodile head. Now I think about it. But anyway, since they only showed her for a flash, that's who I was thinking it was, and I didn't read the credits. So if they credited that as Tawaret, that's a different being entirely. Tawaret is a protective deity who's known for protecting women and children in childbirth, especially. That's her main function, is to protect, because childbirth is a dangerous time where babies frequently die, mothers frequently die. And so Tawaret's primary job is to protect them in that dangerous moment. So she is a protective deity. So she must have shown up then to help Moon Knight out. I did not realize that's who that was. Okay, fair enough.
No, and that no, I don't say that to correct you. I say that because I wanted to know if that was accurate. Because earlier,
so if it's Tawaret, then yes, that the hippo head and everything, yeah, that's what she looks like.
Okay,
I like that she had because they also gave her that really pleasing female voice, which was very, very different than the expectation you'd have for a creature that looks like that. And I thought that was pretty cool.
And the character or the voice is not credited to May Callaway, I mispronounced her name, who plays Layla in the episode, but it also kind of, when I heard it, I thought maybe that was her voice. But so that wasn't to try to correct you, it was to see if that was accurate, because earlier in the series, I think episode 1, they show what they have as a like the representation of Ahmet is, at first I thought it looked kind of like she had a jackal head, but it could have been like it was probably a crocodile. That's the case. Crocodile head, because there are other statues in there that have snout. If they, I don't remember them showing her, so I can't speak to that. But if they showed her with a long snout, then it was a crocodile's head. Okay, so but both of those those are also accurate depictions of those two characters. Yeah. The statue that they imprisoned Khonshu in the show looks more like an image of the god Thoth that I mentioned earlier, because he's got this long beak like an ibis,
But if they showed an image of Ahmet with a long snout, that was almost certainly as a crocodile head, and that is how she appears. She's not usually, since I don't remember that particular image, she's not usually depicted in an anthropomorphic way. So she, like I say, she will have like, a hippo's hindquarters, for instance, and a panther's forelegs, and then like, a crocodile head or whatever the case may be. But she's a mixed form monster, but she's definitely not anthropomorphic or human shaped.
Okay. And I'm not the best at being able to determine what she looked like in that first episode, because it was in the British Museum and they had her on like a picture depiction of it. We have not seen like a character depiction in the movie or in the series. But another thing and you said the correct pronunciation is Tawaret.
Tawaret.
Right? Tawaret. Okay.
Yeah. Egyptian never put stress on the final syllable of a word.
Okay. Tawaret. Thank you. The another thing that I have read is she was the god of like like helping. I'm sorry.
Rejuvenation.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. Is that true? Because that has kind of spawned some theories as to what she's in the series for. And you mentioned that, well, she could be there to help Mark and Steven.
No, she is a protective deity for sure. If like I say, if Tawaret has come into the show, then, which apparently she has, then if they're even remotely using her figure from mythology in the way that it appeared in ancient texts and art, she is, yes, a protective figure. She's fearsome because she's a hippopotamus goddess, but that it's what's called an apotropaic image. Because apotropaic means that you use something that is fearsome or evil to fight something that's fearsome or evil, and so she's a fearsome and dangerous goddess, but she uses that fearsome and dangerous aspect to drive off any kind of like evil spirits or anything that would threaten a mother or child in childbirth. But her purview is particularly over the protection of women and children in childbirth. But that could be extended to maybe protection more writ large. But she is specifically associated with birth and with that sort of aspect of protection.
Okay, there was one more thing that happened in episode 4 that I want to get your thoughts on. Episode 4 was it reminded me so much of Indiana Jones, and going through it and looking for the clues and everything. Where he finds the little statue of Ahmet is in what he says is Alexander the Great's sarcophagus.
Right. Okay. Alexander is hugely important for the last phase of Egyptian history. In fact, he's probably the most important person that there is for the last phase of Egyptian history. I mean, in his lifetime, Alexander the Great essentially conquered what was then the known world, and so every major culture that existed at the time has his stamp on it. Okay. But his entire and this is I could talk about Alexander for a long time. It's a very interesting subject, but his entire plan he was basically the first person to conceive of conquering the world. Mm-hmm. And which now we'd sort of think of as sort of a supervillain kind of a thing. Yeah. But from his perspective, the reason he wanted to do this was to to sort of unify the world and give it a common language and which was going to be the Greek language, and a common system of learning, which was Greek philosophy, and a common style of art, which was Greek art. And that is not necessarily a bad thing, because essentially what he's talking about is making an analog version of the internet using Greek culture. And to a certain extent, the interconnected world that we live in today is the child of Alexander's conquests in many regards, because he put ideas in people's heads about connecting disparate cultures and kingdoms in a way that had never been done before. At least not to that extent. And so anyway, the keystone to Alexander's conquest of the world was Egypt. It was, he actually had defeated, he was fighting the Persian Empire, because Persia had conquered most of the known world at that time, basically everything from the outskirts of India all the way up to the edges of Greece and Northeast Africa, where Egypt is. So, and also the Near East, where modern Israel and things are. And so Alexander was fighting the Persian Empire specifically, and the Persian king specifically, but he actually defeated the Persian king in battle in a decisive victory that could have ended the war. And then rather than continuing after the Persian king, he just let him run back to his capital. And instead, Alexander turns south and heads to Egypt, which he didn't even fight the Persian army in Egypt. It was the Persian forces essentially just surrendered to him when he arrived. And he goes to Egypt, like rather than just taking a quick path to end the war, he goes to Egypt, ends up staying there for like a year or something. And he has himself crowned king in the Egyptian style and called king according to the Egyptian traditional manner. He has himself depicted on the major temples in Egypt's major religious centers in the traditional Egyptian style. And then he founds and personally has a hand in drawing the blueprints for the city of Alexandria that bears his name, which was going to be his capital once he had conquered everything. His plan was clearly not to rule from Macedon, where he was from, which is to the north of Greece. His plan was clearly to rule from Egypt, from the city that he had created of Alexandria, because he recognized that the Egyptian institution of kingship was incredibly ancient, and it was respected by all of the other cultures around it as this incredibly long-lasting and enduring sort of office of authority. And Alexander was trying to be a different kind of king than had ever existed before. He wasn't going to just be king of the Greeks or king of Macedon or king of the Persian Empire. He wanted to be the king of everything. And he was a keen student of history. His teachers were the best minds that Greece had ever produced. I mean, folks like Aristotle was his personal tutor, for instance. And so he knew the circumstances surrounding the rise and fall of many of the sort of kingdoms and empires that had come before him. And he surely knew that one of the chief problems that they faced was that you have a big empire and it collapses because people on the periphery aren't willing to respect the king who's at the center for whatever reason. And so they break away, they rebel, and then the empire crumbles. And so since he wanted to be a new kind of king, he needed a new kind of kingship. And he saw in Egyptian kingship, which was this very venerable and respected institution, because everyone thought that Egyptian culture was the oldest culture in the world. It's not, but people thought that in the Greek world and elsewhere. And so he wanted to be a king in the Egyptian mold because he felt that this was something that would speak to all of the disparate people that he wanted to rule from many different cultures and many different kingdoms to make him the sort of king of kings, essentially. And so Egypt was a linchpin to his plan for conquering the world. And he spent, like I said, about a year there sort of indoctrinating himself into the Egyptian religious apparatus, having himself declared king, having himself depicted alongside the Egyptian gods and appearing on their temple walls and whatnot. And only after he had done that, he actually even went to an Egyptian temple out in the desert and had himself declared a god, which is completely against Greek belief. Yeah. Like for the Greeks, to identify yourself as divine was actually heretical. And so he goes to this oracle that spoke both to the Egyptian king of the gods Amun and to the Greek king of the gods Zeus. And the oracle said, yes, indeed, Alexander, you are a god. And so that gave him the authority to then declare himself divine and embark on this next phase of his conquest. And it's only after he spends a year in Egypt doing all of these things that he finally decides, okay, now let's go and kill the king of Persia and finish this war. And so that ideological aspect of his conquest was equally, if not more important to him than the military aspect of it. It's like by that time, conquering the Persian king was just an afterthought because he'd already decisively beaten him in battle. And so he was ready to focus on this sort of ideological and religious component.
Okay.
And so yeah, Alexander is hugely important to Egypt for that reason.
So
and he was buried in Egypt.
That brings up so many questions that don't have to do with this discussion, but to stick with this discussion, in this series, in episode 4, when he discovers, because it's Stephen at the time, and he's also talking to Mark, when they discover that it's Alexander the Great, he says, and they discover where the statue is. He says he was the voice of Ahmet. So then could that be because of what you just described to me? Sounds like Alexander the Great was doing something that was out of order, that was not anything people had done in the past, not way things were handled in the past. So could you read into it that the series chose for Alexander the Great to be the voice of Ahmet, because you also said Ahmet was seen as, in the series, she's breaking order. She's kind of making judgment before she should make judgment, in some of the same way that possibly the creators are saying Alexander the Great was trying to take over the known world.
That's a cool theory. I mean, that definitely fits. I mean, who knows whether or not they will, explain it in terms that specific, but I mean, that does fit with what with what we were just talking about. Absolutely.
Okay. The next thing that I want to talk about is, are there areas, what areas of the series do you see inaccuracies beyond just what we would probably consider creative liberties to tell the story? What inaccuracies do you see?
Well, the biggest one actually was in that very scene with Alexander's tomb, and this is a creative. It falls in the line of creative liberties. I would say that any so-called inaccuracies in it, I actually would bracket as they're taking creative liberties to tell a superhero story. I mean, so that's really no skin off anybody's nose. But the whole thing with Alexander's tomb was it was interesting to me because first of all, he was buried in Egypt. We know that he was initially, he had asked to be buried in Egypt. And we know that he was initially, his body was taken by some of his generals, and they were going to return it to Macedon for burial against his wishes. Okay. And then another one of his generals who had taken over in Egypt, a guy named Ptolemy, decided that he was going to steal Alexander's body and bring it back to Egypt as Alexander had requested. Now, this was self-serving because all of his generals wanted possession of his body, because whoever had his body would sort of gain prestige just by having the corpse of the great man himself, right? And so everybody had an interest in putting him wherever they were, against necessarily what Alexander himself wanted. But Ptolemy had this additional impetus of saying, well, I want him under my control, which also happens to be in the place where he wanted to be. So Ptolemy actually steals Alexander's corpse and brings it back to Egypt. They inter it for a brief period in Saqqara, I believe, which is a site to the south of Alexandria. But then at some point, they remove his body from that temporary burial and they bury it presumably in Alexandria itself. And to this day, no one has ever found Alexander's tomb. And so no one's ever seen his body. No one knows what his tomb looks like, or what the objects inside of it look like, or anything like that. So the depiction they showed of it was a very traditionally, or it looked more or less like a very traditional sort of Egyptian royal burial. The sarcophagus looked like an Egyptian king's sarcophagus, and all the text and everything on the wall looked very much like traditional Egyptian images. In all likelihood, the actual Alexander's tomb probably would have been very much a Greek-looking tomb. It would have looked more like, it would have had much more heavy Greek overlay with maybe an element of Egyptian stuff to it. It's like for instance, maybe like Egyptian gods depicted in a Greek style, for instance. But it probably would have been a Greek style tomb. But in any case, we don't have that tomb. We certainly don't have his body. And so I found it hilarious that Stephen is so cavalier when he's going to push off the lid of this thing. It's like, because Alexander the Great is arguably the most important person like who ever lived. And I say that because the whole history of the world he's like an axis where you can say everything that happened before Alexander and everything that happened after him. So in a certain sense, he is as important as anyone who's ever existed. And so to find his actual tomb would be one of, if not the greatest discoveries in all of archaeology. And so to be like, I love that Stephen's like, he's like, well, and I feel kind of bad about shoving this off here, but what can you do? And he like pushes off the lid, and I'm just like, wow, that's pretty intense. I guess, it's a life and death sort of situation, and you do what you got to do, of course. But that to me, that made me laugh out loud when I saw it, because we don't know where Alexander's tomb is, and if somebody did find it, it would be a discovery absolutely unparalleled in terms of how important it was. So that's an inaccuracy, but it's also clearly something that they did for the sake of storytelling. And they did make that concession where he was like, kind of like hemming and hawing for a second. He's like, well, I don't really want to do this, but when he like kind of shoves off the lid and then paws around on the mummy to find this statue.
And he does apologize when he essentially removes his jaw. Know, he says, "I'm sorry, Mr. Great." So the next question I have is, we'll kind of sidestep Moon Knight for right now, and I guess the last thing on Moon Knight specific is overall, it sounds like they did a reasonably good job. They've done a better job than other entertainment properties in portraying this.
I would say if you compare the Egyptian elements in Moon Knight to, as the example I gave earlier, the Egyptian elements in The Mummy, I would say Moon Knight is actually a lot more, I find it a lot more convergent with Egyptian thought, if not necessarily Egyptian iconography or whatever. Although, by the way, I looked up that picture of Ahmet that you mentioned earlier, and that is actually a pretty straightforward representation of Ahmet from the Book of the Dead.
Okay. Thank you. So then, outside of Moon Knight, can you give us a few examples of other? You've given us example of The Mummy. Can you give us other examples of entertainment properties, movies, series, whatever, that have either done a really good job or a pretty poor job of portraying Egyptology and Egyptian mythology?
Top of the list, without a doubt, is Stargate.
As
a original movie, not the series SG-1. Without a doubt, top of the list for doing a great job by Egyptology. Obviously, Stargate is a science fiction movie where an ancient Egyptian gets inhabited by an alien and he sets up shop on some other planet. All that, of course, is science fiction. So that's not what I'm talking about. The portrayal of specifically the Egyptian language in that is it's the only movie I've ever seen that actually does it great. And there's a reason for that. It's because it had the advisor for that movie is an Egyptologist, Stuart Tyson Smith, and he did just an absolutely phenomenal job of giving the writers a way to phonetically pronounce Egyptian, and all the Egyptian in it is grammatically and correct, and the vocabulary is on point. And it's really that's, as a language person, as somebody who specifically studies language, that attention to detail on is something that is so badly butchered in almost every instance of ancient Egyptian popular culture portrayals. The language they just ignore, because they're like, nobody knows what this language is like anyway, so we can say anything we want. And you usually just get gibberish or something, or maybe like one word stuck into the middle of gibberish. But Stargate, the language is just great. And they even make some clever in jokes about bad scholarship versus good scholarship. Okay. And there's a scene in Stargate where the main character, who is a Egyptologist and a specialist in language, is correcting a bad translation that one of the government folks had made in this underground. They've got this underground base, and they've got a blackboard, and they've tried to translate this text that they found. And the main character is like going up with a chalk and correcting the errors they made. And he's sort of mumbling to himself as he's correcting it. And the corrections he's making, first of all, are correct. And then as he's like making his corrections to their bad translation, he's like, oh, they must have used Budge. And, Budge was this old British curator from the 1800s, okay, who is widely known today as a rather poor example of Egyptological scholarship for various reasons. And so, but his books are widely available. Like if you go to like a bookstore, you often see books by Ernest Wallace Budge. And so a lot of people's exposure to books about Egypt is from this guy whose scholarship is not the best, and whose understanding of the language is definitely not the best. And so when he's correcting this bad government translation, like, oh, this is, they must have used Budge, that's just a hilarious in-joke. And I don't know if the writers thought of that or if the advisor thought of it, but it's just hilarious. So I would put Stargate right at the top.
Okay.
beyond that, there's so many things. I mean, from the original Mummy movie with Boris Karloff is amazing, just in terms of a sort of its feel, not so much in terms of its historical accuracy, but in terms of its general feel of slow moving sort of phantasmagoric dread, I think is just wonderful. In Indiana Jones, there's the central part of the movie is when they finally locate the Ark of the Covenant in the Egyptian city of Tanis. There is no connection between the Hebrews Ark of the Covenant and the city of Tanis in reality,
Okay.
but the city of Tanis itself is a little known to most people ancient Egyptian city that is more or less, buried beneath the sands of Egypt. And so it was really cool to see that city mentioned and figure prominently in a work of fiction. Then a lot of times when you see Egypt in popular culture, it has a sort of a biblical overlay, because like they'll do like movies that are about the Bible specifically, like the Christian Bible. You think of something like the class, like the Ten Commandments, Charlton Heston, or like the Prince of Egypt, the more recent animated film.
Yeah.
Right? And these have greater to lesser elements of historical accuracy in them. The depiction of Egyptian society in the Prince of Egypt isn't half bad. Some of the set pieces in some of the older movies are really fantastic, like the Cleopatra movies. There's the 3 original Cleopatra movies all have fantastic set pieces that they really put a lot of attention to detail in. So there's a lot of stuff out there that's varying degrees of accurate in terms of its visual aesthetic, less stuff that's accurate in terms of its sort of psychological component in terms of what the Egyptians actually thought.
Okay.
Because we usually like to view the Egyptians through the lens of the storytelling that we're doing.
Yeah.
And so in a movie that's about the Bible, they're viewing it through the lens of Christianity, and Egypt occupies the role of villain in the Christian Bible. And so that's heavily skewed against what the Egyptians themselves would have thought. When we were talking about something like Moon Knight, or then they're viewing it through the lens of telling a particular story about superheroes in a world that has certain rules that govern it and stuff. And so the Egyptian thought is in service to that primarily. And so the mental side of things is less well represented. That's actually there, but in Moon Knight, I think that there actually are some pretty good thoughts behind it as well. So,
and I was going to ask, where do you think Moon Knight? We're 4 episodes in, so if things go off the rails in episodes 5 and 6, you're not going to be held to this. But right now, as what you have seen, where do you think Moon Knight ranks with its portrayal of the mythology? Like you said, Stargate is far and away number 1
because of its language component.
Okay.
Yeah, Stargate because of its language component, which is in its sort of in jokes that it has. Moon Knight, I think, because the Egyptian language doesn't really figure into Moon Knight, so it doesn't speak to anything there. But in terms of, like I said, what the characters are doing, what the Egyptian characters specifically, the mythological Egyptian characters are doing in the show, makes sense more or less in terms of the Egyptian worldview. And so if we extrapolate what the Egyptian gods might be doing today, if they, since they had passed time from 2,000 years ago when their culture basically was replaced, then it's not an unreasonable portrayal of what they might be doing today. I think probably the best sort of parallel that I would give where it's a story explicitly about what, not just Egyptian gods, but what gods are sort of up to now that their original cultures have fallen by the wayside. I think immediately of American Gods by Neil Gaiman, the book, which is outstanding, and to a lesser extent the TV series, which is very good but not as good as the book, and that it's specifically about gods living in today's world and trying to just like make ends meet, basically, now that they don't have worshipers and things like this anymore. And so, like there's new gods that have emerged, like technology and things. And so there are some cool portrayals of Egyptian deities in that, Egyptian gods who have gone on to become undertakers, things like this.
Okay.
And so I think that Moon Knight is I actually think that it's fairly consistent with the general Egyptian worldview.
All right. Thank you. And the last kind of topic before we get to the rapid questions, and those are really quick. But what do you think what are the next steps for anybody who wants to learn more about Egyptology and or Egyptian mythology from watching this series?
Yeah. Well, the easiest step is to buy a book that's by somebody who knows what they're talking about. And so whenever you go to look at a book on like Amazon, for instance, you should always look at the about the author.
Okay.
And this is one of the most important. If you're buying a nonfiction book, I think it's the most important thing to do that most people don't do, is to actually read that paragraph that says about the author. And if the author is someone who got their degree from a university and their degree is in, something relevant to the topic that you're talking about, in this case, say Egyptology, and maybe they've worked in the field, it'll say, and they worked at this site, or they've published these other books, or, they're, that you read and see that, oh, indeed, this person is a scholar who studies these things, as opposed to someone with an armchair interest who may or may not really know what they're talking about, and certainly doesn't have or won't have the depth and breadth of knowledge of somebody who is a professional scholar. So I would say that for someone interested in learning more about Egypt, go buy a book about it, but look at the about the author section and see who the person is that wrote it. Now, in terms of your class, which is located here on campus in Memphis, right? So take a class. This coming fall semester, I am offering ARTH, Art History 2000, which is an introduction to Egyptology, and there's no better place to start than that. I mean, I am a pro who's been working in this field for quite a few years, and we talk about everything from popular culture and Egypt's influence on things like magic and New Age thought, to the ancient Egyptian religion and their architecture and everything. It's a very fun class, and I would recommend anybody who's interested in Egypt and learning more about it as a first step to do that. No prerequisites. ARTH 2000.
Perfect. Well, thank you. That as an entertainment company, and you mentioned at the beginning, like when you were talking about when we said what's the importance of exposure of all of this, and you said it's advertising, it's promotion, and that's the first kind of way that you're going to be exposed to something. And so do you think Marvel and Disney, do you think these entertainment companies have a responsibility in teaching beyond the exposure? Or do you think that if they did, I guess, try to teach beyond the exposure, and maybe we'll see, I'll be interested to see in the making of series or the making of episode, if they, how much kind of help they got, how much, if they brought someone on that was an expert in the field. But do you think there's a responsibility to teach more about this, or is it just the exposure and then allow people to go get information elsewhere?
Well, it really, it's a kind of a complicated answer. I think it really depends on who the audience is for the particular programming that they're creating. So if you are creating material to be consumed by children, then I think anyone in any area that's making media that's designed to be consumed by children does have explicitly and have a responsibility to, promote values that are beneficial and ideas that aren't, crazy and things like this, and that are good for the child, the individual, and for society. And so if the audience is a children audience, then yeah, I do think they have that responsibility. Now, when you're making art for adults, I personally don't think there's any responsibility whatsoever to do anything other than make your art.
Okay. One thing that
as adults, we should be able to we should have an expectation that we are discerning enough that we can consume art and make our own decisions about it in whatever capacity that might be, and not put that on the artist. I don't think that an artist in any media, music, painting, television, film, comics, has any responsibility other than to the art that they make.
Okay. All right. Thank you. One thing that's so interesting about Disney Plus is, it has the 5 major brands in the United States. Outside of the United States, it has 6 brands, but in the United States, it has the 5 major brands of Disney, Marvel, Pixar, Lucasfilm, and National Geographic. And just like a quick search for Egyptology or just the word Egypt in Disney Plus brings up about 4 or 5 National Geographic programs that were all released before Moon Knight was released. Because I kind of think if Disney and Marvel said, okay, now that you've watched this, why don't you watch a program about this that where we can, I think that people might be a little cynical with that and thinking like, well, you're doing this for promotional purposes. And yes, you're going to say how accurate you were, and you're not going to maybe point out all these inaccuracies. But I think for me, it's interesting that now on Disney Plus, I can go and I can watch those programs if I want. And I would like the step I think would be interesting to take is, like on Disney Plus, there's that suggested for you section. It might be neat for some of those to pop up in there.
Yeah.
That because you watched Moon Knight, watch this, and
yeah, I couldn't agree more.
They did something similar with, I don't know if you ever watched The Right Stuff when it first came out on Disney Plus. They had the dramatic series, but then right after that, like a week or 2 after that, they had a documentary called The Real Right Stuff, which I thought was really interesting in the way that they did it. And it also brings great corporate synergy with including National Geographic with some of the properties that are, I shouldn't say purely entertainment, but are definitely more entertainment than education. And so before we get to the rapid fire questions or the rapid questions, is there anything else you think is important to mention about Moon Knight and its portrayal?
I think we've hit most of the bases. I would point out that in the comic, he's not actually a mummy, and I thought that was a cool character decision to make his white outfit because of mummy wrapping. That was kind of cool.
Yeah, and it definitely is. I have looked up the Marvel Legends characters, like the action figures, and they're coming out next March, and they have one for Moon Knight and Mr. Knight that
they just came out with a Moon Knight skin in Fortnite as well.
Yeah, I saw that yesterday as well. Yeah. So, well, thank you for doing this. As I told you, I like to close out with a few rapid questions, and so I have 4, and they stick to the Marvel universe and the MCU. Out of the MCU or Marvel comics, do you have a favorite Marvel character?
Ooh, that's a tough question. Honestly, as a little kid, I liked, well, no, I was going to say it changed, but honestly, it hasn't. There's so many that I could say that I really liked, but overall, from when I was a child up until today, yeah, I do have a favorite, Doctor Strange.
Okay.
I could not be happier that he's finally getting his due in movies. I think they're great. I think they're doing a great job of capturing the weirdness of the comic.
Yeah. And I mean, he's going to be a linchpin moving forward, Yeah. In the class, the students do a project where they identify a Marvel character that they see in themselves or they want to see in themselves. Is that Doctor Strange for you, or is there another Marvel character that you identify? Okay.
Oh yeah. I mean, he's not my kind of doctor. He's a medical doctor, but he is a doctor. So he's highly educated. He's a bit arrogant, which always speaks to me. I don't know what I don't know what that says. I'm a bit arrogant. I can admit it. and you know, and he uses his all of his plot devices revolve around his knowledge and outthinking his opponents, and in creative and ways, and using his, you know, he's you know, well versed in all of these ancient, you know, tomes of ancient lore and whatnot, and that's what I do professionally. I study ancient works of knowledge and magic and you know, mythology and all this stuff. That's specifically what I do as my job. And so yeah, I totally see myself in Doctor Strange.
Okay, all right. Is he a bigger influence on you than Indiana Jones now at this point?
Yeah, yes, because Indiana Jones is, there's the best line in all of Indiana Jones, I think, is when in the beginning of the first Indiana Jones film, he's talking to his rival, a French archaeologist named Belloc, and Belloc says that they aren't true archaeologists anymore, that they've fallen from the purer faith.
Yeah.
And that's exactly right, because they have both sort of become tomb robbers, and they basically break into sites and take artifacts, to steal artifacts they bring back to sell to their institutions. And that is not what archaeologists do. And so
very far from it.
I think it was really awesome that they put that line in there, where he's the way he phrased it is so sophisticated. He's like, you know, we've fallen from the purer faith. And I thought that was just genius. And so yes, so Indiana Jones is not the kind of role model for actual archaeology that I would put forth. It's more the idea of him as just sort of a cool guy. I mean, you know?
it's the introduction, and then go learn what what they actually do. Do you have you grew up a big comic fan? Do you have a favorite Marvel comic run? So either like a favorite run about a character within, you know, I mean, there's been probably 20 runs about Iron Man and Captain America and all that. Do you have a favorite run of a specific character or subject?
Yeah, Jean Grey from the X-Men. Her entire character arc from when she's her character arc post Giant Size X-Men #1, which is when the newer team of X-Men was introduced. She essentially dies, or appears to die, and then returns as the Phoenix, and then is sort of becomes consumed by the power of the Phoenix to become Dark Phoenix, and threatens the existence of the entire universe, and has to be destroyed by her own friends and lover, and then only to rise from the ashes of her death as two different individuals, who then are involved in an even more convoluted storyline involving Mr. Sinister and Apocalypse and all these things. And I think that whole arc of Jean Grey's character, that takes about like 15 years to complete in terms of the comics, is an absolutely amazing character arc for somebody to change over time. And you know, she's not just a static figure. She's, you know, she goes through all of these different evolutions, and you know, there's tragedy in it, and revelation and everything. And without a doubt, that's my favorite character arc from all of comics.
Okay. And I'm glad you mentioned Apocalypse, because Oscar Isaac, who plays Moon Knight, also played Apocalypse in X-Men.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah, he plays that character in that movie. We have about 3 minutes left. What do you have a favorite MCU project, either show, movie, that you've seen so far?
Yeah, I'm sure I do. I would say, I don't know. Probably a lot of people might disagree with this, but I got to say, Thor Ragnarok was so fun. Yeah, it was so fun to take, because I mean, he had Thor, who's also one of my favorite characters since I was a little kid. He already had like a lot of like sort of like good like humorous lines in the earlier films, and to sort of like lean into that and make essentially a comedy action film with him was so much fun. I thought that was just a really, really good movie. I love that they brought in elements from Planet Hulk in there by having the Hulk imprisoned and everything, and fighting as a gladiator. That was a great movie.
Well, it actually is one of the funniest movies I've seen in a very long time, but just full stop. Doesn't matter if it's MCU or anything. And I have really enjoyed Thor's character arc in the MCU, especially like from where he started to where he was at the end of Endgame, the representation of he's depressed but he can still help, and I like all of that aspect of that, and then to what it looks like we're going to get in Thor: Love and Thunder. The last question of now, because Disney purchased Fox and they have access to all these other characters, is there a character or series or project that you want to see made that is not available right now?
Yeah, no, they need to bring in the X-Men to the
Okay.
MCU. The X-Men is, such an important piece of modern storytelling, and now with them, I think the movies that were made originally outside the MCU are great. I love them, but most of them anyway. But the cool thing, but they didn't have they didn't adhere to the aesthetic of the comics in the way that the MCU movies do. And so I think I and millions of other X-Men fans would be really anxious to see the X-Men portrayed sort of with more in line with the aesthetic of the comics. Okay. And to see them integrated with the Avengers and things like that, because in the comics, they all inhabit the same world and whatnot. And it's and I really, and that's one of the reasons that merger took place, is they want to, they obviously want to capitalize on the money making power of the X-Men franchise. And so, yeah, I would really like to see that happen. I'd like to see the new X-Men movies. The last one that got made, the New Mutants, was great, and so I want more mutant stuff.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for taking the time to talk through all of this, answer all of the questions that I had. That, as I said, I'm sure seem very elementary, because they seem elementary to me. This was a lot of fun. For people who want more information about this, or have questions, what's the best way that they could get hold of you?
My university email address.
Okay.
It's publicly available on the website. Just look for Joshua Roberson and you'll find it.
All right. Well,
look
perfect.
for Roberson. Actually, I'm probably the only one.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. And I had a really, really great time with this. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Absolutely. You too. Thanks for inviting me.
Bye.
Bye.